Welcome to Have History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and it is January 1st when this video is premiering. This is an important day in American history. It was on January 1st, 1863 that the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. The Battle of Antietam provided Abraham Lincoln a victory by stopping the Confederate invasion of the North, and that victory gave him the confidence to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. However, he issued the preliminary Emancipation in September 1862. That statement said that if the rebellious states did not rejoin the Union by December 31st, 1862, the proclamation would take effect on January 1st, where all slaves within areas of rebellion would be henceforth and forever free. So, in this video, I wanted to break down the proclamation and what it was designed to do. That on the first day of January, AD 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. And the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons and will do no act or acts to repress such persons, or any of them in any efforts they make for their actual freedom. When the war began, politicians and military officials debated what was to be done with African American slaves who ran into Union lines. Were they to be returned to their owners? The Fugitive Slave Act was still in effect, which stated that the slaves had to be returned to their owners. However, the southern states had left the Union. But Lincoln did not believe secession was legal, so therefore they couldn't actually leave the Union. And I know this topic is much more nuanced than I'm explaining, but for brevity I will leave it at that. The incident at Fort Monroe, where slaves were taken into Union lines, brought about the first Confiscation Act, declaring slaves contraband of war, since the Confederacy used them for the war effort by building fortifications or simply planting and harvesting crops that fed Southern armies. The enslaved had forced politicians and military officials to take action about their status. The Emancipation Proclamation took that a step further. Now, therefore, I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, by virtue of the power in me vested as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States in time of actual armed rebellion against the authority and government of the United States, and as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion, do on this day of January AD 1863. To satisfy politicians who did not believe the president had the power to free slaves, since that was a power vested in the states, Lincoln made sure to announce it as a war measure. Lincoln himself had despised slavery since he had witnessed slavery in Louisiana in his youth, but to issue this proclamation, he called upon his presidential war powers. As James McPherson put it, slave labor was so important to Confederate armies as well as on the home front that the government impressed slaves into service before it began drafting white men as soldiers. Thousands of slaves worked as army laborers, teamsters, cooks, musicians, servants, and in other support capacities. They provided much of the logistical tail of these armies, functions initially performed by white soldiers and civilians in Union armies, and thereby freed a high proportion of Confederate soldiers for combat duty. As time passed, more and more Yankees began asking, why not convert this southern asset of black labor into a northern asset by confiscating slaves as enemy property, freeing them, and putting them to work for the Union? Now, did Lincoln believe that Confederates would free their slaves upon hearing about this proclamation? No, but this would safeguard slaves who ran into Union lines. And just as important, black and white people would spread news about emancipation, and it worked. Slaves all over the South heard that their freedom and safety was guaranteed if they could just make it into Union lines, which made them more likely to run away, especially if the Union Army was coming close. This heavily hindered the Confederate war effort. Next, Lincoln outlined the locations where the proclamation would take effect. I have listed them on the screen as they are written in the document. Notice that parts of Louisiana, Arkansas, Virginia, and the entire states of Tennessee and West Virginia are left out of the proclamation. The reason why is that those areas were already under Union occupation by this point in the war. I know that not all of Tennessee was in Union hands, but the entire state was left out of the proclamation's jurisdiction. And by virtue of the power and for the purpose aforesaid, I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states and parts of states are and henceforward shall be free, and that the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authorities thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of said persons. Lincoln includes this to outline that it was the Union Army's duty to ensure that freed peoples were kept free and, if necessary, protect them. And I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared to be free to abstain from all violence, unless it necessary self-defense, and I recommend to them that in all cases, when allowed, they labor faithfully for reasonable wages, and I further declare and make known that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sorts in said service. This section of the proclamation did two things. One, it allowed freed slaves to work for the Union Army for a wage, which would free up soldiers to enter combat. Second, it allowed African American males to enter the Army. By enlisting African Americans, the Union Army would greatly increase its numbers, which would put the Confederacy at an even greater numerical disadvantage. Initially, Lincoln did have some backlash from abolitionists and the free African American community in the North, because the military role for black men was as non-combatants. But that policy would be taken away, and many black regiments would gain honors for their service. And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity, I invoke the considered judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God, in witness whereof I have hereunto set my hand and caused the seal of the United States to be affixed. Done at the city of Washington, this first day of January, A.D. 1863, Abraham Lincoln. Thank you all so much for watching and supporting the channel. I hope this video helped clarify what the Emancipation Proclamation did and why Lincoln chose to issue it. Thank you all again, and have a great day.
Historian, historian, where do you roam? Historian, historian, far, far from home. If history will travel, he's the card of a man, a professor with knowledge in the heartland. To educate the world is his mission. A professor of fortune is a man called historian. Historian.